museum back to life.
You know, people sit out on the front porch hoping people will come by.
Go forth and do good. It's insane. I have the most understanding wife in the world.
I treat everybody the same thing.
Oh, that's the other thing I love about Marietta. It's like a melting pot.
You are listening to Marietta Stories. Each week, veteran podcaster Bill Nowicki brings you the heartwarming, interesting, and fun stories from the people that make the community of Marietta, Georgia, a place to call home. Here's your host, Bill Nowicki.
Hey, I'm super excited to bring Season 4 of Marietta Stories. We're going to start with St. James, and there's some really good reasons for that. And I'm going to let Chris Brown of that community talk about St. James and William Root, who had a huge part in this whole history of Marietta. And what's cool about it, even though the Yankees burned down the courthouse, they at St. James have records that go back to 1842, and we're going to talk about the graveyard where the slaves were buried, what they spent their money on in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, what the community did about marriage of slaves. It's just fascinating to me, and I know you're going to enjoy it, but I'd like to thank a bunch of folks who helped put this whole season together. Amy Reed, Krista McKay of the Marietta History Museum, and Diane Call, who kept me on track, kept me organized, and put together a great plan to do Season 4, and she did a bunch of logistics. And Victoria Lamos of Archive Atlanta, and you can find Diane's podcast, The Pause Button, and Victoria Lamos's podcast, Archive Atlanta, on the podcast app. And let's get started. Chris Brown of St. James, Marietta. All right, here I have Chris Brown. You're on the vestry at St. James now?
I have been. I'm not on it now, but I have been over the years.
Okay. All right. So he was on the vestry at St. James, but he's kind of taken upon himself to be the historian here at St. James Episcopal Church. He's shrugging his shoulder. It's right along the tracks on Church Street, and there's fascinating history. And I guess we'll do a little background about the Episcopal Church and the types of records you've uncovered. So welcome, Chris, to Marietta Stories podcast.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. A lot of interesting stories to tell, so I'll try to take a few of them.
Great. Sounds great.
The church requires that each parish keep a record of its communicants and services in something called the parish register. And also the vestry, which is the lay leadership of the church, keeps minutes of all of its meetings. And here at St. James, we have those documents going back to 1842 when the church was founded. So it's a very, very rich set of information from which you can piece together the history of the church and its people.
Yeah. And St. James, even the name, it goes back to one man, William Root.
Well, there were a couple of things happening back in the late 1830s and early 1840s that led to the formation of St. James. The main thing was the railroad. The railroad was being built from what would become Atlanta towards Chattanooga, and Marietta was an early stop on that line. And the engineers who were laying out that railroad were Episcopalians, as it turned out. Charles Garnett and Stephen Long, the chief engineer and the assistant chief engineer, both had an interest in founding an Episcopal church here. So you had the railroad that was bringing people in and activity to Marietta. And then you have William Root, as you mentioned, someone who moved to Marietta in 1839 to open a dry goods store. He had a lifelong experience as an Episcopalian. So you had the nucleus of these people who wanted to form an Episcopal church, and it was then a matter of organizing, talking to the bishop, and getting agreement that a church could be founded here.
I'll talk about the William Root's Philadelphia's roots in the Episcopal Church.
William Root was born in 1815 in Philadelphia and was raised an Episcopalian. His father died when he was 3, and he had a tough life as a kid, and the church sort of became his home. And so he was taken under the wing of one of the priests at St. James Church in Philadelphia, so that when he moved south and became involved in the organization of this, he requested that it be named St. James for his home church in Philadelphia, and that was the way we got our name.
Great. So how did this I guess they got approval for 1842 being the beginning. How did William Root become part of that founding members of the church?
He was one of about 10 people who got together to organize the church. And when the church was first set up, one of the things they do is elect a vestry, which is the lay leadership that will guide the business affairs of the church. The clergy, the rector, the priest, they're in charge of the worship, but the vestry is in charge of the business affairs. William Root was recognized and appointed the junior warden at the time of organization. He was also appointed treasurer, and he was the head of the Sunday school as well for both young people and adults. He held those three positions for 50 years until his death in 1891. So he was
junior warden. What's a junior warden?
Well, the junior warden traditionally has responsibility for the property of the church. And so he was both treasurer and sort of in charge of the property as well as one of the organizers.
Where was his store in relation to the church? And the church right now is in the same location, right?
The church is in its original location at the corner of what's now Polk Street and Church Street. Right across the street where there is now used to be the Sarah Freeman Clark Library, that's where William Root's house was first. So he was right across the street from the church, and his store was on the square. There's a little alley coming off the square called Root Street, and his store was right there at the north side of the square at what's today Root Street.
Yeah, so he's really baked into the whole history of the church. So you started looking at the records, both the financial and the minutes from the vestry. What kinds of things did you find?
It was interesting. William Root kept what he called his cash book, and in fact there is one that has survived in our records from 1850 to 1873. It records all of the income, all the donations, all the expenses of the church over that 20-plus year period. And it's interesting to see what the church spent its money on back then. One of the largest expenditures for the church was candles.
What?
And you don't think about that in today's context, but if you take yourself back to 1842, when it got dark, you better have candles. Yeah. And so the church regularly purchased those. Other staples of running a church, firewood would be another thing in the wintertime to keep the place warm. So it gives a really interesting snapshot of how different life has become and what you had to do to run an operation back at that time.
Now, were there slaves as part of the church?
Yes. The old church building had galleries above, and there are some notations, some in William Root's hands, that refers to the fact that the slaves sat in those galleries above at the church. There are other records of the church that show that the owners of the slaves either expected or welcomed or certainly allowed participation in church services. And there's a sketchy information in the records, but it's pretty clear that enslaved people were part of the church. For example, 6 of the first 12 marriages of the church, starting in 1842, were between slaves, and not always owned by the same owner. So that the record is rich with references to enslaved people being baptized, being married, having funerals, participating in the church life as everyone could. Now, this is not to make any sort of an excuse for people who kept enslaved people and let them come to church, but on the other hand, it gave a rich experience to those who did.
I think we talked on the phone. You said how meticulous his records were.
Well, they record every single donation from somebody down to a $1 donation, and every single expenditure, some of which were below $1. Many of them were for repairs to the church and that sort of thing. They're everyday expenses, but he recorded everything. And so again, it's a great record to have if you want to look for those little-known facts that are long gone from what we think of today.
What were the records like during the period of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain?
Well, if you think about the Civil War generally, starting in 1861, the battle scenes were not close to Marietta for the large part until later on in the war. And so life at St. James went on as normal, other than the fact that the sons of parishioners had gone off to war. But services were held twice every Sunday. Baptisms, marriages, funerals continued on through the time period until the Union Army started to move from Chattanooga down towards Atlanta. And then the parishioners began to leave to protect themselves from the potential battle that was going to be fought essentially all the way from Chattanooga down to Atlanta.
So did the Root family leave?
They did. They went to Washington, Georgia. They left in mid-1864 and came back. I think they came back in early 1866, 65 or 66, but after the hostilities were over. And the church was a wreck. I mean, the church was used as a hospital. It definitely suffered the effects of having an occupation army in town. And gradually it began to have its parishioners come back, and it had to start from scratch in terms of getting furnishings for the church. There, no doubt things were very difficult.
Well, why don't we talk through some of that's a great background. Why don't you talk through some of the stories that you uncovered just looking through the records and you've heard through different sources?
One more thing about records before we leave it. It's extraordinary what we have found original documents for in our record. For example, we have the original consecration of the church, the official document consecrating St. James Church in 1843. We have the list of people who donated money to build the church in 1842. We have the contract between the vestry and the builder of the church to actually construct it. We have the contract to paint it. We have the contract to plaster it. It's really remarkable how many original documents from those very first days are still in our records.
Did they have to take a loan out?
No, they raised enough on the very first day of raising money to know that they were going to be able to complete the church, so that they started construction in, I think, September of 1842, and by the time the church was consecrated in 1843, they had raised the money to pay the bills and start going. That's not to say things have been easy, because St. James's history has been one of giving away what we have, which is what churches are supposed to do. But money has been an issue, been a struggle since the early days, and even today there are challenges that have to be met.
What were the costs of the different building? Do you have a total of that?
I think the church cost $2,200 to build and get ready to go. That was not insignificant, and there were about 30 or 40 people, I think, who were on that list of subscribers, and those gifts would range from $5 to several $100s. Like every church, there's a handful of people who are the ones who really sustain it. William Root was definitely one of those people. A gentleman named Edward Denmead, who made his money furnishing cross ties and lumber for the bridges for the railroad. He owned about 1,000 acres just north of the Marietta Square, but he was a faithful supporter. A fellow named Archibald Howell, whose house still stands over on Kennesaw Avenue, was another one of those people. In about 1860, the vestry decided it was going to do a renovation of the church in order to make it more appealing to the rector, to the priest, to keep him here. He was thinking about leaving, so they decided, let's spiff the place up. And that's when the bell tower was built on the front of the old church. Of course, today's church is not the old church. It burned in 1964. But the old church had its bell tower put on there, and that was a total expenditure of about $1,500 to do the improvements that they did. And William Root's notes in the vestry minutes say that because of the coming of the war, it was difficult to raise money, and the main burden fell roughly to the wardens of the church to pay the bill. Well, that was Edward Denmead and William Root, to the tune of about $1,200 that they footed out of their pocket because the congregation was not in a position to fulfill their pledges. Sometimes you're stuck. You have plans. The timing turns out to be unfortunate, and you're stuck having to then do what you have to do. Mm-hmm. Especially Anglican churches, Episcopal churches, bells play a really important role. They call people to worship. They toll for funerals. They ring for weddings. They're really a part of church life. And so St. James needed a bell at some point. We went about 3 years before we got our first bell. And in a letter in 1870 from Charles Garnett, one of the organizers, to William Root, he was reminiscing and say, I remember that before we got the first church bell, we constructed a steel triangle. And William Root was a triangle man, clanging it with a hammer to use it as a substitute for a bell. And that worked for a couple of years until the church finally decided we need to subscribe and get a bell. So they took up a collection and ordered about a 300-pound bell and hung it in the bell tower. So there was St. James and its first bell about 1845 or so. Well, the Civil War came and metal was at a premium. And a letter was circulated from General Beauregard of the Confederate forces to the planters of the Mississippi Valley. And it was beseeching them to contribute whatever metal they could, including their plantation bells, to be melted down for armaments. And this letter got shared at St. James, and the patriotic fervor sort of took over. And the congregation said, well, we'll donate our bell too. And so the bell was taken down and donated to the Confederate forces, and it was taken off. And the legend is, of course, it was melted down into cannon and used to fight for the Confederate cause. But it turns out that's not exactly what happened. William Root wrote a note on the back of a piece of paper that said that the bell was sent to New Orleans, but it was captured by the Federal forces, which occupied New Orleans at the time, apparently, and it was sent up to Boston, where if it was melted down for armaments, it was for the other side. and that's, as Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story that is not commonly told. But it's in William Root's handwriting, so, I mean, my guess is that he had some insight into what actually happened. So that church bell didn't quite get its intended effect. In 1868, I think, the church asked the city council of Marietta, could we hang the city's fire bell in our tower and we'll share it with you, because the city's tower apparently was not safe for the bell to be rung. So the city said, okay, look, if it's a civic emergency, we'll ring it and it'll be our bell for church services. You can use it. So we struck this deal, and it lasted for 15 years or more, until 1878. And then the city came calling and said, hey, we'd kind of like our bell back. Well, the church made an offer and said, if you'll take $100, we'll buy it from you and we'll just leave it hung where it is because it works now. And the city, unfortunately, said, no, $150 is our firm price and we're not going to budge from that. So the bell came down and was returned to the city. And for a little while, St. James did not have a bell. But in the early 1880s, one of our former rectors had moved on to Cincinnati. His name was Samuel Benedict, and his wife had died a few years earlier. He found out that St. James was raising money to buy a bell, and he wrote back to them and said, if you'll dedicate the bell to my wife Julia, who passed away a few years before, I will both add to the collection and I'll see that the bell gets founded in Cincinnati where there was a bell foundry. And the vestry decided that was a good deal because Julia Benedict was beloved here at the time of the Civil War. They agreed. And so in 1882, the bell dedicated to Julia Benedict was brought here and hung in our tower. And it rang for every church service from 1882 until 1964 when the fire occurred and the bell was damaged and it needed to be recast. Well, it turns out that the Schilling family, a well-known family in Marietta, wanted to dedicate the recasting of the bell to Frederick Schilling Jr. And so that was arranged, and when the bell came back from being recast, it is now known as the Benedict shilling bell, and it continues to be rung for every service. So that, again, it's connected back to the time of the Civil War, still in use today and will be in use. And the only additional chapter in bells is the fact that St. James has got a ring of 8 change-ringing bells hung for English change ringing, and a guild of ringers that rings them every Sunday. So people who are in the vicinity of St. James on Sunday morning will hear our 8 bells being rung. And it's not a carillon. There's not a machine up there ringing them. There are 8 individual ringers, each pulling on a rope to ring their own bell in sequences, so that it's not a well understood practice that goes on there, but it also is grounded in Anglican tradition going back 400 or 500 years.
How many bells are there in Georgia like that, change ringing style bells for Episcopal Church?
There are 3 churches in Georgia. There's one in Augusta and in Atlanta and Marietta. So there are only 3 here. There are 5 more in Charleston, South Carolina, for example, and there are about 60 or so in the United States. So that it's a practice that was transferred from the mother country in England and put up in the colonies and gradually has spread to other places.
Cool. All right, I got Elizabeth Denny with me. Let's talk about Johnny Walker Realty. Since we started Marietta Stories 3 years ago, Johnny Walker Realty has grown tremendously. How's the culture changed?
My big fear in joining a company early stage was if it grew, would that change the culture? Johnny and Carrie have done an amazing job of making sure that everybody who joins Johnny Walker Realty really does follow the major tenets of the company. People who are absolutely customer focused, people who compete only with themselves, and people who understand that even though this is an absolutely high-stress job, you can still have a whole lot of fun doing it if you don't let it get to you.
You can contact Johnny and Carrie. They're at 262 Church Street. You go to johnnywalkerrealty.com or call them up at
678-626-0403.
I don't know if you want to share the organist story.
Oh, the wedding story? Sure. That's interesting. One of the most notorious stories, again connected to the time of the Civil War, is the fact that a young lady in the parish happened to fall in love with a Union soldier who was part of Sherman's detachment occupying the town. The Union soldier proposed to her, and she accepted. Her name was Eliza Fletcher, and she was the sister of the longtime organist at St. James. And the wedding was arranged to be at St. James shortly after the end of the war. And this did not sit well with a number of people in the parish. But it just so happened that the substitute organist in particular wanted to make a statement about how she felt about this Southern parishioner marrying a Union soldier. The substitute organist came to the wedding dressed in mourning black because this was a very sad day as far as she was concerned. Well, one version of the story says that the rector, the priest, made her go change into more suitable attire, and the wedding was held. But there's another version, and this is the one told by Sarah Gober Temple in her landmark history of Cobb County called The First 100 Years. It says that the wedding music was played as a funeral dirge to reflect the sentiments of the congregation to this marriage. Well, we don't know which one is technically correct, but what we do know, again, going to the parish records, is that this wedding was held on May 17th, 1866, where Lawrence Emmons was married to Eliza Fletcher at that point. So that we know the wedding happened. Some of the details may be a little fuzzy, but it's a good story.
It is a good story. Talk about the rector at St. James during the Civil War.
Yeah, this was Samuel Benedict, and a beloved rector. He was here for about 10 years. He was born in Connecticut, educated in Connecticut, and was called to St. James when we had lost our rector. We lost our rector because we had to cut his salary. We were not able to raise enough money to pay him what we agreed. This was a problem because he had a family to feed, and so he said, I can't stay. So he left, And that means that the vestry has got to get its heads together and find recommendations and call a new person to come and be the rector. Well, they had heard through some reference, some third party, of Samuel Benedict, a young priest up in Connecticut. So they communicated with him and negotiated a contract agreement with him for him to come here. Well, a Connecticut Yankee may not be the person you would expect to convert to the Southern cause, but in fact, that's what happened. And Samuel Benedict became a rector who was very much associated with the Southern cause, although he did not own any enslaved people as far as we know. But he did spend some time as the chaplain to the Confederate Army in Tennessee. That was recommended by the Bishop of Georgia, that every priest in a church spend some time as a chaplain. So he did. He kept remarkable records in this parish register. And not only did he note the church services that were held, he noted observations of Confederate holidays where the bishop or one of the commanding generals would request a day of fasting or a day of prayer. Samuel Benedict noted that in the parish register in a number of cases. And he also told the detailed story of his experience when the Federal Army came to Marietta. That's another story we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but Samuel Benedict, as a priest, had duties that he felt obligated to perform for soldiers as well as for parish members, so that the parish register says in many cases he would baptize soldiers who were at Big Shanty at Camp McDonald, just north of here in Kennesaw. He would baptize soldiers that were about to go off into war, performed funerals for soldiers, and buried a number of Confederate soldiers in the St. James Cemetery. Some of them, there are records that they were moved to other cemeteries. Others, there's no further mention that I'm aware of, but there are no markers for them, so that there may be soldiers that were casualties that were buried at St. James who still are there, as opposed to being moved to the Confederate cemetery, which was established not far away from the St. James Cemetery. The other story about Samuel Benedict is the fact that he was exiled from St. James during the Civil War. When the Union Army occupied Marietta in July of 1864, the soldiers came and arrested Samuel Benedict and the associate rector for refusing to pray for the President of the United States, which is a part of the Book of Common Prayer. It's a prayer we still say today. But the Bishop of Georgia had instructed bishops in Georgia to pray not for the President of the United States, but for the President of the Confederate States.
Chris meant to say that priests were told to pray by the bishops for the President of the United States.
This was not a good thing as far as the Union Army was concerned, so they arrested him when they came, and they held the two priests for 2 or 3 days in the Marietta Hotel, and then they let them go to their homes, but were essentially under house arrest. And in fact, Samuel Benedict had to sign a pledge that he would not communicate with anybody except his family and his good friend Archibald Howell, who was a wealthy parishioner, until further notice. Then at the end of August, he was instructed that he had to leave the area and would have to go somewhere outside the control of the Confederacy. So what he did was to pack up and take his family. He had 5 or 6 children by now, to Canada. And he spent from mid-1864 through 1865, and in early 1866 he returned again as rector of St. James. But he was gone completely from the country for more than a year as an exile. One little interesting tidbit is that the day before he left for Canada in exile, he took the time to baptize the infant son of Henry Green Cole. Henry Green Cole was a known Union sympathizer who, after the war, donated the property for the Marietta National Cemetery. But here you have a Confederate sympathizer baptizing the son of a known Union sympathizer before he goes off into exile. It's just one of those little tidbits in the records that pops up and says, things don't always go the way you expect them.
Well, they're very complicated. I mean, we have a complicated history: slavery, war. What happened when there wasn't a rector here? Did they still have services?
There was a substitute rector who came in early 1865, so there was probably about a 6-month time period when, yes, the church records just stop, and so one assumes that there's not a rector in charge. J.J. Hunt, the Reverend John James Hunt, filled in a number of times for St. James when we were between rectors. It's entirely possible that he would have done some of the duties at that time. I don't know that for a fact. But a gentleman named Charles Grant was assigned to come and be the fill-in rector from early 1865 until Samuel Benedict returned in 1866. So he began keeping the parish register at that point and did perform some baptisms and weddings and funerals, just as you would expect.
When William Root finally retired or whatever after 50 years, what kind of record does it give that talks about that retirement?
He essentially served as senior warden and treasurer and Sunday school chair until the end, until he died. What I understand is he lost his hearing, and obviously as he got older, he couldn't do everything that he had done earlier. He was made the honorary chair of the church properties. I'm sure that the junior warden, for example, expanded his role on the vestry so that William Root didn't carry the whole burden. But no, he stayed active at St. James until he passed away. He had various businesses on the square, some of which succeeded and some of which didn't. And then I think in probably the 1880s, he essentially retired from business and went to live with one of his sons who was here in Marietta.
Now, why is he buried in the Confederate cemetery versus St. James Cemetery right across the street?
He's in the city cemetery, but it is an interesting story why the founder of St. James, the senior warden for 50 years, is not buried in the church cemetery. And the reason is because his wife, Hannah Simpson, was from a family that founded First Presbyterian Church right next door. So that the families sort of split their worship with Hannah going to the Presbyterian Church, William coming here, children being baptized here, but I suspect married there. And I have to fill in the gaps here, but one suspects that the discussion with Hannah and William was, I'm not going to be buried in the Episcopal cemetery. I'll be buried in the city cemetery. You can join me if you like, I guess. But in fact, they are. Their grave is in the city cemetery. And otherwise, there are many, many, many prominent Mariettans and St. James people in the St. James Cemetery, but not William Root.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the St. James Cemetery. You're in charge of that, right?
I'm on the cemetery trust board that manages the St. James Cemetery, and it has a history that goes back to 1849. Actually, it begins about 5 years earlier than that. In 1844, the vestry purchased 20 acres of land between the location of the church up on the railroad tracks running west to what's now Wynn Street. 20 acres, so it's a quarter of a mile and a big piece of property. After 5 years, in 1849, the church decided it wanted to establish a cemetery, so we set up a committee to figure out where on these 20 acres would be a good place to put it. And the decision was that the northwest corner, which is at the corner of Polk Street today and Wynn Street, is where they were going to lay out the first cemetery. It's hard for me to visualize what that property might have looked like in 1849, but I suspect it was pretty wild, and there was just a wagon track going out there. There was not a street. Polk Street wouldn't be named until after the Civil War, when General Polk was killed in the vicinity. So that just thinking about a wild place about an acre in size as the St. James Cemetery, it's hard for me to imagine. But what happened was they laid it out and laid out different types of or sizes of grave plots for different prices. You could get a 32 by 32 for $20, a 16 by 32 for $10, and a smaller one for $5. But there was always a struggle, I think, to keep the place manicured, to keep a fence around it. The fence kept disappearing for firewood. And there was an ongoing discussion about how to handle enslaved people with the cemetery. The vestry, on several occasions, wrestled with that and decided that it was okay to bury servants, as they were called, in their owner's plot up to a limit. And there was actually a place in the cemetery set aside for, again, this is the word of the time, Negroes, to be buried in single graves. And this was the part along Wynn Street, kind of the western end of the cemetery. And there are not a lot of good records that say what happened. There is a handwritten note from William Root which says, "Some Negroes buried about here," so that would suggest that they're putting those graves where they had planned to put them. But today there is no marker there that suggests that African Americans were buried there, and whether that property simply got taken up and resold to other members of the church, that's possible. Wow. That's part of the history that's not crystal clear about how it came out.
Isn't there a famous illustrator buried at the cemetery?
Yes. Alfred Woad, who is a British artist, came to the United States before the Civil War, but during the Civil War he worked for Harper's Weekly, which was a weekly illustrated newspaper that reported on the war, and he followed the armies around, made some of his money sending back drawings to the publishing place to depict battlefield scenery. He made some of his money drawing portraits of officers who wanted to have them made up and sent back home. So he was here during the conflict, and he also came back later. He came back on a contract basis to recreate some battlefield scenes. This was in, I think, 1891, when he fell ill and died. His family was in the Northeast somewhere, I think Connecticut. But for whatever reason, the decision was made to bury him here rather than send his body back, so that a very small plot with a very small marker says Alfred Woad. You wouldn't know it unless you could make the connection with the name. But he was an artist who started out his career with Winslow Homer, who was starting out his career also as a war correspondent. So he was traveling in good company and is a well-known artist.
All right. Any more stories that you wanted to share about St. James?
Well, I didn't mention about the cemetery is it has all this history, and it has about 1,400 people buried there. But it is still active. There are still grave spots. There are still some places in a cremation garden or niches in a columbarium, so that although the property has been used for 150 years or more, 175 years, there are still burials there, either in plots that are already owned or in a few that are yet to be purchased. The other thing is, when the cemetery was set up, the vestry adopted an agreement for burial, so that it was the formal contract between the vestry and the person who would have a burial there. And I want to take a minute and read this because only a lawyer could write it and I could never remember it. It says, "If the purchaser is found to have used at the interment of himself or themselves, or of his or their family or families, any strange, unusual, or disorderly burial service or ceremonies, inconsistent, discreditable, or repugnant to the spirit of the Christian religion, then the said right of sepulture shall lapse from said purchaser and his heirs and assigns forever, and shall revert to the said vestry as fully as if the same had never been granted." So if you did something in your ceremony that was objectionable, You forfeited your right. Well, there's no record that anybody ever invoked this clause, and it disappeared from the later versions. But as we started out, we had some very firm rules about how burials were to be done. And then the other thing is, because the parish register is so detailed, it details every burial service held in the church, and it says where the person was going to be buried. And they were typically buried either in the city cemetery or the St. James Cemetery. But there are about 75 people listed on that parish register for which there's no marker in the cemetery. So that either somebody didn't want a marker, or they had a wooden cross, or they couldn't afford a marker. For whatever reason, there are people buried there. We know they were buried there because of the parish register, but we don't know exactly where they're buried because there is no marker. And so again, you've got a cemetery that carries this tradition and history, some of it anonymous, and will always be so.
All right, I want to ask you about JonBenet Ramsey. How did she end up in that cemetery?
I don't know a lot about her family. Her sister was killed in a car accident in the, I want to say the early 90s or maybe late 80s. And her parents had bought a plot there. So her sister was buried there first. And the Ramseys lived in Colorado, I think, pretty much the entire time of this time period. They were not here, they were not church members, but had the burial plot. And so when JonBenet was killed and needed a burial spot, she was buried here. Her mother, who died of cancer, is buried here. There's several other family members, so that it's a regular family plot. And it still draws a stream of people who come just to look at the grave or to hang a little trinket or leave a little bit of something there. It's a remarkable connection between JonBenet Ramsey and the public who has heard the story. But things have really settled down. The only time things get somewhat more active is if there's some news story or something else that awakens the awareness about it. But things have settled down a little bit, and we would rather have them settle down. She's there resting in peace.
So let's wrap things up. St. James still has how many services on the weekends?
2 services every Sunday. There's a 10:30 and there's a 12:30. But there are even songs and other special services throughout the year that are very special.
Yeah. And you have one of the best breakfasts in town, I've heard.
I've heard as well. I get the best breakfast in town at home, but this may be the second best.
Yeah. St. James is such a cool place. There's people like you that really care about preserving history, but you're not stopping there. I mean, you're constantly evolving as a church, too.
The church has to stay relevant. Its eternal principles have to figure out how to stay relevant with the world as it changes around it. And that's a challenge both for the vestry and the clergy and all the members of the congregation.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Was there anything else that we didn't talk about?
I can't think. I think you hit just about everything I've got, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris Brown. I appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed doing it.
A few other things Chris wanted me to mention. They have morning prayer Monday through Friday. They have a healing service on Wednesday evening. And they have things like the Low Country Boil. They have activities going on like the Wonderful Days Race in January, which was actually episode 1 of Marietta Stories podcast. So check them out at stjamesmarietta.com. And please let a few folks know about Marietta Stories podcast. You can subscribe on the podcast app so you don't miss an episode. This is Bill Nowicki saying thanks for listening, and we're going to have another episode about the history of Marietta coming soon, and maybe some bonus episodes stuck in there. So hope you'll check them out.